This is the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Let's open the big book on the coffee table. Okay, let's see here. And we have a reading from Ezekiel, the 47th chapter, the 1st to the 9th verse. Then they jump to the 12th verse. But the angel brought me, Ezekiel, back to the entrance of the temple of the Lord, and I saw water flowing from beneath the threshold of the temple toward the east. For the facade of the temple was toward the east, which is exactly what it is. Now, let's think about Ezekiel. Ezekiel was in exile at the time. Ezekiel lived around 623 BC, and he died in Babylon. So the temple had been destroyed. So he was describing a temple that was to be rebuilt. I think that's kind of important for us to understand. That's how I read Ezekiel. I don't think he's describing the rebuilt temple that was built after the return from the exile in Babylon. We read that those who were very old, who had seen the temple of Solomon, wept not for joy but for sorrow when they saw the rebuilt temple, the temple that had been built by the returning exiles, because it was such a sad little thing compared to the beautiful temple that Solomon had made. And that temple, well, it managed for about 400 years plus, until Herod decided to rebuild it and made this glorious temple that was considered one of the most beautiful buildings in the ancient world. The central shrine, the holy place, was about 13 or 14 stories tall, and the front of it, according to Josephus, was plated with gold, and it shone so brightly in the morning sun that you couldn't look at it with the naked eye. So it was a wonder, and people came from all over the world to see it. But I don't think either of those temples, the temple that Ezekiel is describing, he is describing the temple as it is restored by Christ. We read, from beneath the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the facade of the temple was toward the east, water flowed down from the right side of the temple, south of the altar. He led me outside by the north gate, around to the outer gate facing east. I saw water coming out from the right side. Now, let's jump to the Gospel of John, because we read in the Gospel of John, blood and water flowed out from the side of Christ. This is John 19:43. It was the custom to break the legs of crucified people. It calls the crucifragium. Fragium meaning breaking and crucis meaning cross. Because, you see, you couldn't breathe unless you could pull up on the nails in your hands and feet. It just was a grisly death. If you hang yourself by your wrists, you can inhale, you can expand the chest cavity, but to exhale, you have to pull yourself up and shrink the chest cavity. Horribly painful if you are nailed to the cross. And so part of the means of death on the cross is a slow asphyxiation. It's just awful. They would break the legs of people crucified when they wanted it to end, because then you couldn't pull yourself up anymore and you suffocated. But when they saw that Jesus was already dead, they didn't break his legs. And that was a fulfillment of prophecy, that you didn't break the bones of the Paschal lamb. So instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear just to make sure he was dead. Immediately, blood and water flowed out. And very interestingly, verse 35 says, the one who saw it has testified to this, and his testimony is true. He knows that he is telling the truth, so that you also may believe. I think that's very interesting, that this is such an important verse, that the testimony has to be proven. Now, these things happened so the scripture would be fulfilled, not one of his bones will be broken. It is one of my harebrained theories that John, the beloved disciple, the author of the Gospel of John, I believe, and other sections of the scripture, was from a priestly family. That's my belief. Why do I believe that? Well, there's a tradition that was true. And he had the run of the high priest's house. When he and Peter appeared at the door, the serving girl, recognizing John, the beloved disciple, opened the door and let him in. That would be like you're having the run of the governor's house. You were a person of importance. And our Blessed Mother, remember, was from a priestly family as well as the Davidic family. She was a kinswoman to Elizabeth, who was from a priestly family. And it is strongly thought, as a strong tradition, that John was actually a relative of Jesus. So these families were intertwined, and I think it's reasonable to think that John was from a priestly family. So that said, if it's true, John would have been just thunderstruck when he saw blood and water flow from Jesus' side, because Jesus had said, "Destroy this temple and I will build it up in 3 days." And he was speaking of the temple of his body. You see, blood and water flowed from Jesus' side, and blood and water flowed from the side of the temple. The blood in the priestly courts was just, it was gory. It was an abattoir. It was like a slaughterhouse. And so every day they would have to flood the court of the priests and wash the blood away, and it would go into drains and then around the foundation of the temple and it would flow out of the side of the temple and into the Kidron Brook. So this idea of a flow of blood and water coming out of the side of Jesus, blood and water flowed out of the side of the temple. And very interestingly, in the Shroud of Turin, you have exactly that. You have the wound in the side, and then you have the something that can only be seen under ultraviolet light. There is a serum, blood. What would have happened in the crucifixion is the pericardium, the area around the heart, would have been filled with a clear fluid from blood. That there's something in blood called serum, which is clear. It looks like water. So when the heart was pierced, both water and blood would have flowed out of Jesus' side, what looked like water. And the evidence of this pleural flow, of this serum flow, is visible on the Shroud of Turin, but only under ultraviolet light. It couldn't be seen before the middle of the 20th century. So those people who say, well, it's clearly a medieval forgery, well, I wonder why the medieval forger would have put a clear liquid that was invisible to the eye until the 20th century. I wonder why he would have put that on. I'm being sarcastic. I have no doubt the Shroud of Turin is what it purports to be. So, moving along here. I know this is a little complicated, but John would have been, as I said, thunderstruck to see this. And let's get back to the reading that we're looking at, that water flowed out of the temple and it flowed out of the side of Christ. And remember, Ezekiel is a prophet, and he's prophesying. And what does he say? He walked to the east, and he measured 1,000 cubits. That's 1,000. A cubit is from the tip of your finger to your elbow. It's a little more than a foot. So he goes a little more than 1,000 feet, and the water's thicker, and that gets deeper and deeper every time he measures out another 1,000 cubits. Soon it's a river that he had to swim through. And he saw the bank of the river many trees, and it flowed into the eastern district down upon the Araba. The Araba, that word just, I don't know why they don't translate it. It means the desert. And it empties into the sea. In other words, the Kidron Brook emptied into the Jordan, which then emptied into the Dead Sea. That's the geography of the Holy Land. But he's seeing this not as the Kidron and the Jordan and the Dead Sea, but he's seeing it in a spiritual way, that the water from the temple flows into this river, and the river gets big, and it purifies the waters of this salt sea. It makes it fresh, and nothing can live in the Dead Sea. That's why they call it the Dead Sea. Fish can't live, nothing can live. What he's saying is the temple is a model, is a kind of prophecy in itself of what's going to happen, that this flow of water coming into this river will purify the river, nurture trees, will give life. What did Jesus say? Out of me will flow rivers of living water. So these physical things are prophetic. The temple, even the water flowing from Jesus' side on the cross, and the reminder that we have in the Shroud of Turin, these are prophetic, that the life-giving stream is Christ. He said, from him would flow rivers of living water. And the fruit shall serve for food and the leaves for medicine, that we will be nourished by that flow of blood and water. And we read the flow of blood and water is the origin of the sacramental life of the church. Now, let's go quickly to the gospel. This is just very interesting that, again, the Gospel of John was written I believe, for those people who thought that John the Baptist was the Messiah, and John the beloved disciple, who had been a disciple of John the Baptist before John the Baptist told him to go and follow Jesus. Well, John the beloved disciple, I think, wrote his gospel emphasizing water, because these Dead Sea sectaries, be they the Essenes or the followers of John the Baptist or whatever groups there were, they were fanatical in terms of ritual purity. They bathed constantly, and water seems to have been very important to them. Well, the Gospel of John is all about water. The woman at the well, this pool of Bethesda, Jesus saying, rivers of living water will flow from me, and blood and water from Jesus' side. These are all in the Gospel of John. So, there's a pool in Hebrew called Bethesda, which means the house of mercy. Chesed means mercy or loving kindness or the generosity of God. Well, people would go there, and they would, when the water bubbled up, they would believe that there was an angel touching the pool, and the first one in would get healed. Now, whether that happened or not, I don't know. Moving along here, very interestingly, people who said the gospel is just nonsense pointed out that the pentagonal shape for a building didn't exist in the ancient world. A pentagon has 5 sides. Buildings were square or round. There were no known buildings with 5 sides. And so clearly this wasn't reflecting any real historical event. Well, guess what? They dug up the pool of Bethesda, which was a water source for the temple, which needed huge amounts of water for purification. And it had 5 porticos. 4 sides, and then a portico running down the middle. And there was an upper pool and a lower pool, and when the water from the upper pool flowed into the lower pool, it would cause it to bubble up, thus the belief that it was an angel doing this. So, again, we try to read these things with our awareness instead of reading them in their context, the context of the time in which they were written. And if you do the archaeology, there you go. This was very, very accurate. So it's fascinating that. And one more thing I want to comment on this. Jesus slipped away, and they couldn't arrest him. And then he found the fellow who had been healed, and he said, "Look, you're well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse may happen to you." Well, that sounds like sickness is a punishment for sin. And, there are sicknesses that when we expose ourselves to sin, that we endanger. You drink too much, you might risk cirrhosis. You fool around too much, Lord knows what you're going to risk. But that's not what's being said. Look, you are well. Do not sin anymore, that nothing worse may happen to you. What Jesus is saying here, I believe, is that sin is worse than a physical disease. So the man went and told the Jews that it was Jesus who'd made him well. And then didn't matter that he cured the sick. What mattered was he didn't follow their interpretation of the rules of the Sabbath. So very discouraging. This whole motif of water is very important. We don't think of it because, well, we've got lots of water, at least where I am. We have good old Lake Michigan. And however, if you're in places like Arizona these days, or California, maybe you think about water. Well, we have enough water. And in the ancient world, because water is life, and Jesus used it as an analogy for true life.
Like what you just heard? Share it with your family and friends, and thanks for listening.